3 days before the wedding. The Lawsons held a bride appraisal event for me. The full mark was 100 and I scored 89. Eaves Lawson, my fiance, sighed in front of the guests. Rules are rules, Amelia. You scored less than 90, so the wedding will be delayed by a year. My best friend, Wendy Shaw, stood right beside him, begging with tears in her eyes. She's already great enough. Can't she have another shot? In my previous life, I thought they were actually defending me. So I held back my dissatisfaction and waited for a year. Over that year, the Lawsons' estate project made money. Eaves changed the prenup terms, and Wendy eventually became the one to marry Eaves. My eyes snapped open, and I was back to that appraisal event. I looked at the score on the screen, and I took the mic. I accept the delay, but before that, I'd like to find out who graded me a 1. The whole estate went silent the moment my score was revealed, 89. One more mark and I'd have passed. A message written in fine print read, "The score is lower than 90. The wedding shall be delayed by a year. Along with the partners' trust fund, the estate project's profit and right to reside in the main house. Post-wedding, the Lawson wrote those into the Declaration of Trust. The year before, I gripped my champagne glass, beads of water trickling through the cracks between my fingers. In my previous life, I smashed the glass right here and demanded to know why they thought they could grade me, like I was livestock. I waited for a year. Within that year, the estate project's profit came back to the Lawsons. Eaves wrote the prenup terms, and Wendy married the man I was supposed to be my husband. Amelia, Eaves' voice pulled me out of memory lane. Melanie, Eaves' mother, put her cup down. This set of rules has remained within the family for 3 generations. Amelia. Wendy was seated around the table reserved for my friends and family. She didn't have the privilege to be sitting as a judge, but Melanie said she was my best friend and knew me the best. Wendy stood up, the edges of her eyes red. She's a brilliant girl, Mrs. Lawson. Then she looked at me and continued with a trembling voice. She's just always in a hurry, and not great at being considerate to her elders. I held up my champagne glass, but said nothing. That girl pretended she was speaking up for me, only to make me look like an impatient woman who didn't know how to treat my elders. Eaves held my shoulder down. It's just a year. That was a clear warning right there. I put the glass back on the table, and it clinked against the porcelain plate. Eaves looked at me. He was probably getting ready to pull me outside and sweet-talk me into submission. I picked up the mic on the table and turned around to smile at him. Rules are rules, and so I accept the delay. Wendy picked up a tissue and held the corner of her eye. Her head hung low, but I noticed the curvature of her lips. Eaves heaved a sigh of relief, and I nodded. But if we're talking rules, let's also talk transparency. What do you mean? Melanie looked at me. I pointed at the screen. I scored 89.
Fine.
However, I want to know why I had marks docked.
Bow.
He means clubbing to whammy her burrow. The butler was standing at the other end of the table, and he was in charge of projecting the screen. Eaves frowned. The grading's anonymous. Amelia, you don't have to get into the nitty-gritty. I'm not asking for names. I'm asking for details to figure out where I messed up, so I can improve. Melanie said, "Show it to her." The butler pressed his tablet, and the screen changed. It showed my base average. It was 93, but there was also a note that was written in fine print. Unusually low scores aren't included in the base average, but it triggers risk control and deducts from the base average. 4 marks. And it showed where I was docked. 2 unusually low scores lit up. 1 mark, 3 marks. I clenched my fists. So not everyone in this family thought I was unfit for marriage. Someone scored me unusually low and triggered the deduction. Eaves' face fell, and he spoke up faster than I could. System must have gotten it all wrong. Wendy's tissue fell onto her lap. She bent over to pick it up, but the back of her hand hit the edge of the table. I didn't look at her. Instead, I held the mic close to my lips. As I looked at Melanie straight in the eye, "Mrs. Lawson, can you save this detailed breakdown of the grading? I'd like to get feedback from these particular judges." During tomorrow's explanation, Melanie fell silent before nodding. "Of course." I put the mic down. Eaves tried to hold my hand, but I moved away and bent over to get my purse. When I turned around, Wendy had just raised her head. Our eyes met. Her eyes were still red-rimmed, but her mask was starting to crack. I was already walking out of the estate's entrance when Eaves caught up to me. The winds were biting tonight, and he draped his coat over my shoulders. "Don't take what happened tonight to heart, Amelia." I looked at his cufflinks. He asked me to pick it out for him last month, citing that the choice of his wife would be the pride he wore. Now his wife's wedding would be delayed, all because she missed 1 mark. I didn't take it to heart, I said as I returned the coat to him. He didn't take it as he frowned. So, why'd you ask for the details? Just wanted to see where I messed up. I looked at him so I can be better next year. A while later, the frown on his face softened. A year isn't that long. Once the estate project's money is with us, the wedding will be better.
I'll make it up to you then.
We'll hold the wedding on the lakeside field. I interrupted Eaves. Aren't you curious about who scored me that lowly? Maybe some of the elders expected a lot from you. Giving me 1 mark goes beyond expecting a lot. I retorted. He grabbed my hand with more force than I expected. We have a lot of guests tonight. Don't make a scene here. I looked at his hand. He wasn't worried about my feelings. He just didn't want me to go against him. My phone buzzed. It was Wendy. Are you alright, Amelia? It's also been hard on Eaves tonight. Don't get mad at him. Then another text followed. I talked to Mrs. Lawson. There won't be a lot of guests tomorrow. Don't put too much pressure on yourself. I stared at the messages and laughed. This woman was more concerned about defending this entire farce than I was. Eaves saw Wendy's name on my phone, and he let go of my hand. Wendy's really kind. She put in a lot of good words for you. I turned the phone off. Tomorrow's the perfect time to thank her. Then Eve froze. For a moment, and I went into the car. The driver asked for my destination, and I told him an address. The Lawson estate side door. Half an hour later, I was already in the car. Outside the side door, the system manager was sitting across from me, took a photo of the equipment's label, right after he pulled it off. In my previous life, I heard him talking to the butler. Checking the names of the ones who graded the bride requires the organizer's authorization or the bride's application for a recheck. I slid over my ID and invitation. I'd like to ask for a recheck. Mr. Zimmer went through the documents and looked at me. You can ask for a recheck, but I can't give you the names in private. If you apply for the recheck tomorrow, the system will unlock the names automatically. I asked, what if someone tries to stop me? He turned the tablet to me, and there was a line of fine print read right at the bottom stating, if the results are used to delay the wedding, change the candidate, or withhold access from the trust fund, the bride may ask for a public recheck. I pointed at change the candidate. What do they mean change the candidate? Lawson's added this function when they first ordered the system. The wedding's delayed if the bride scores less than 90. When that happens, they can switch the bride candidate out during the deferment. These people were already plotting against me long ago. They didn't trip me up on a whim. They made sure a backdoor was there, so they could change the candidate. I texted Melanie, Mrs. Lawson, I'd like the system handler to be there during the explanation. Tomorrow. A while later, she answered curtly sure. She wanted me to confess I had failed right in front of everyone.
Perfect.
Mr. Zimmer asked, should I get anything else for tomorrow, Miss Oliveira? I checked the terms for the recheck. A screen mirroring cable. I'm going to unlock the names live tomorrow. The incessant messages from the wedding group chat woke me up the next morning. It used to be Amelia Oliveira wedding planning, but now it was the Lawsons delay explanation. The group leader was no longer me but Wendy. She posted a long notification. I'm so sorry for the disturbance, people. Amelia's in a bad mood right now. I'll handle guests and hotel liaison as well as a tire safeguard. Everyone replied with a simple noted. The wedding planning manager asked, do we still go on with the gown exhibit this afternoon, Miss Shaw? Wendy answered quickly, yes. Mrs. Lawson doesn't want the flow to get messed up. She's going to talk about my family's case after the tea party. Doesn't want the flow to get messed up. I immediately straightened. This was where it started in my previous life, where I was slowly kicked out of the picture. It first began with the delay, which allowed Wendy to handle the liaison. Eventually, she was the one who wore that gown and took that family dinner photo. My phone buzzed. Was Eaves? She's very meticulous. Don't read too much into it. Sure, I answered. It took a few minutes before the next reply came. You don't have to attend the tea party. Mom doesn't want it to be awkward for you.
The tea party.
I let the words roll on my tongue for a bit. If the bride candidate scored less than 90, the Lawson could switch in a new one. That was why the tea party was arranged. Right after the score was announced, I changed into a new set of clothes and went to the bridal shop. The shopkeeper froze up when they saw me. What brings you here, Miss Oliveira? I scanned the display. One of the glass cabinets was empty. The backup gown was supposed to be there. Satin mermaid dress with small flowers embroidered on the hem. I had altered the design myself. Eve said, there must be a gown that was mine, and only mine during the wedding. I pointed at the empty space. Where's my gown? The shopkeeper went through the shop's records. Miss Shaw took it earlier in the morning. She said the Lawsons are having a tea party later, and she needed to borrow it to show off a little. I smiled. Did she wear it? The shopkeeper didn't look at me. She tried it out. How convenient. gave her a spot on the panel, and the spot is the group chat's leader. Now she was even authorized to pick my gown up without me knowing. I didn't needle the shopkeeper since she was just doing her job. Instead, I asked her to give me a copy of the pickup record. Wendy's name was written on the paper, and the reason for picking the gown up was that she needed it for the tea party. I folded the paper and tucked it in my bag. Then I left the bridal shop without a fuss. The driver was waiting at the entrance. I told him I wanted to go to the club near the Lawson estate. There was a semi-public parlor on the second floor, and the door was ajar. Melanie's voice traveled through the air. Stand straight. A Lawson daughter-in-law must be gracious. I was standing right outside. Wendy was in that satin gown standing before a full-body mirror. The flower embroidery hugged her calves. Eaves was standing beside her holding a brooch. He pinned the brooch against Wendy's chest. Instead of stopping this farce, my mother left me that brooch for last night's event. Wendy borrowed it from me to add some color to her gown. After the event, she said she left the brooch in Eve's car and would return it tomorrow. Now it was pinned against her chest. I could hear her promises turning into mockery. Right then and there, Wendy saw my reflection in the mirror, and her face went white. Eaves turned back, his hand still inches away from her chest. The air itself froze. I didn't go in. I took my phone out, snapped a photo of the pickup record, and turned the camera to the parlor. Another snap cracked through the air. Eaves frowned. What are you doing? I tucked my phone away. Nothing. Someone has to explain why she's wearing my gown when I'm supposed to be the bride candidate for the tea party. The explanation's tomorrow. Remember, the explanation for the delay was held in a small hall in the estate. The Lawson's elders and the wedding planners were there. Eve was on the stage holding the mic. There were dark circles under his eyes, but he spoke firmly. We're gathered here to explain the delay for the wedding. That would have happened for me and Amelia. Amelia is a great woman, but marriage isn't something that can be done on a whim. She's still young and needs time to grow. I was watching him from the audience seat. This was the same thing he said in my previous life. He rephrased the delay into protection and humiliation into growth. Melanie continued, the family does not take marriages lightly. The score is just a reminder, not humiliation. If Amelia can change after a year, the wedding will proceed as planned. Wendy was at the side. She wasn't in my gown, but a white dress. However, the brooch was still on her chest. She stood up and bowed to my uncle. Please halt your ire, sire. She's an understanding woman, but she cares too much for the wedding. I don't want anyone to pin the blame on her, as if that woman was just pretending to take my side, when in reality, all she was doing was pushing all the blame on me. I opened my bag and touched that pickup record. Melanie looked at me. Our guests are gathered here. State all your grievances loud and clear. That was fake grace. She made it clear that anything I had to say was nothing but grievance. I stood up. Mr. Zimmer was in the last row, and his laptop bag was on his lap. I took to the stage and took the mic from Eaves. He said in a low voice, don't make this worse for all of us. I ignored him and turned to Melanie. The wedding's delayed by a year because I only scored 89.
Correct.
Melanie frowned.
Yes.
And your family has the right to choose a new candidate during the year. Her face fell. This is family protocol. I nodded and placed the pickup record on the document camera. The screen lit up and everyone was shown the reason for the pickup. The Lawson's tea party. Wendy paled. I looked at her chest. Wendy, why did you borrow my gown for the candidate's tea party? And why are you wearing the brooch? My late mother left me. Wendy quickly clutched the brooch. This is a misunderstanding. Mrs. Lawson wanted my help to test the event's flow. That's all. Eaves defended her. That's my mother's idea, not hers. Sure, we can skip the gown for now. I turned to Mr. Zimmer. Mr. Zimmer stepped onto the stage with his laptop bag. Melanie shot up from her seat. What is the meaning of this, Amelia? I want a recheck. I placed my invitation and ID on the document camera. The results have been used for the delay and change of candidates. I have the right to a public recheck. Miss Zimmer plugged in the screen mirroring cable, and the details of the anonymous scoring jumped onto the screen. Base average, 93 point. Deduction for risk control, 4. The fine print was still there. Unusually low scores aren't included in the base average, but it triggers risk control and deducts from the base average. The low marks were an eyesore. 1 mark, 3 marks. Eaves sidled up to me and spoke in a voice that was barely higher than a whisper. That's enough. I looked at the screen, refusing to back down. No, it is not far from it. Mr. Zimmer typed in the recheck code. A system notification popped up. Reveal reviewers' real names. Eaves tried to press a button, but Mr. Zimmer stopped him. The recheck is already underway. It cannot be stopped. Mr. Lawson. I pressed yes. Soon the screen shifted. The first reviewer's name was revealed. 1 point. The high-definition LED projector hummed quietly, casting a stark white glow across the polished marble stage of the Lawson estate. For a split second, the silence in the hall was so absolute that you could hear the soft click of Mr.
Zimmer's laptop keys.
Then, the red text flared across the screen. Reviewer number 12, score, 1 out of 100 Wendy Shaw. Reviewer number 03, score, 3/100 Eaves Lawson. Gasps rippled through the audience, like a sudden gust of wind over standing wheat. The Lawson family elders leaned forward, their expressions shifting from calm arrogance to stunned disbelief. The wedding planners froze, laptops hovering mid-keystroke. Wendy's face drained of every drop of color. Her lips parted, but no sound came
out.
The tissue in her hand crumpled into a tight, damp ball. Beside me, Eaves's posture went rigid. His jaw tightened so hard a muscle twitched violently along his cheek. He took a sudden step forward, reaching out to grab Mr. Zimmer's tablet. There's a glit. Don't touch the equipment, Mr. Lawson, Mr. Zimmer said calmly, stepping sideways to block him while maintaining a professional smile. The system audit trail is hard-coded into the venue's local server. Every vote is tied to the unique biometric login assigned at 8 o'clock yesterday evening.
Ms. Shaw.
Logged in using the guest panel tablet issued under your mother's authorization. You logged in through the primary Air account. I stood center stage, the heavy brass microphone cold in my palm. I turned my gaze slowly from the screen to Eaves and then to Wendy. 1 point, I said into the mic. My voice was smooth, devoid of the hysterical rage they had been bracing for. From my best friend, who wept in front of the entire estate last night, begging the elders to give me another shot. Wendy stammered, her hands trembling as she pressed them against her skirt. Amelia, listen to me. I must have hit the wrong button. The interface was confusing. I thought one was the highest. The interface uses a slider from 1 to 100, labeled with explicit text markers. 1 equals unfit and 100 equals superior. I interrupted, my tone crisp and clinical. You managed to navigate the rest of the application just fine to send. Group chat announcements, Wendy. I turned to Eaves. His eyes were wide, panicked not by sorrow, but by the public humiliation unfolding before the high society guests and media representatives seated in the back. And 3 points, I continued, staring into his eyes. From my fiance, the man who stood here 10 minutes ago, telling everyone that I was young and needed time to grow. You didn't just delay this wedding, Eaves. You deliberately engineered the deduction to trigger the risk control clause. Melanie Lawson slammed her porcelain teacup onto the wooden armrest. The tea spilled over, staining her pale gray silk dress. Amelia, that is enough. This is a private family affair. It stopped being a private affair the moment you published my 89 score to every guest in the city, I said, turning my eyes directly onto the Lawson matriarch. You used your 3-generation family rule as a shield to publicly humiliate
me.
But the rules cut both ways, Mrs. Lawson. I stepped off the podium and walked deliberately toward Wendy. Every eye in the room followed my movement. Wendy shrank back into her chair, her eyes wide with terror, but she had nowhere to go. I stopped right in front of her. Without waiting for her permission, I reached out and unpinned the heirloom diamond brooch from her chest. Wendy flinched as the pin slid free from the fabric of my altered dress. This belonged to my late mother, I said softly, holding the glittering brooch up to the light so everyone could see the custom Oliviera crest engraved on the back. You picked up my dress, wore my size, and pinned my mother's legacy to your chest before the official delay was even finalized. Tell me, Wendy, did you practice sitting in the main house overnight, too? Amelia, Eaves snapped, striding down the steps toward us. He grabbed my wrist, his grip bruised tight. Give that back to her. You're acting like a lunatic in front of our investors. We can talk about this in private. I looked down at his hand on my wrist. In my previous life, this grip used to intimidate me. It used to make me shrink, wondering what I had done wrong to make him so angry. Now, it just disgusted me. With a swift, practiced motion, I twisted my wrist against his thumb, breaking his grip instantly, and brought the sharp point of the brooch's pin right against the back of his hand. Eaves hissed, drawing his hand back instinctively. Touch me again, Eaves, and I won't just recheck the score, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that only he and Wendy could hear. I'll audit the Lawson estate project's offshore escrow accounts. Eaves froze. The color drained from his face even faster than it had from Wendy's. The silence in the hall stretched until it became suffocating. Melanie rose from her seat, trying desperately to regain control of the room. She adjusted her diamond necklace, smoothing her posture with stiff grace. Guests, please excuse this minor misunderstanding. The system clearly experienced an input error. The Lawson family will review the technical parameters and— There is no input error, Mrs. Lawson, I said, walking back up to the stage and placing my hands flat on the podium. And there won't be any need for review, because as of this exact second, I am officially invoking Clause 14 of the Lawson Trust Framework. Melanie's eyes snapped to mine. What? Clause 14? I recited from memory, a memory carved into my mind over a year of cold nights in my previous life. If a bride candidate's deferment is triggered by deliberate internal sabotage or non-impartial scoring, the candidate reserves the absolute right to unilaterally terminate the marriage contract, liquidate all premarital capital contributions, and revoke all corporate land leases granted to the Lawson estate. Eaves stared at me in sheer terror. Amelia, stop. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying, I said. I looked past him directly at the head of the Lawson family legal team sitting in the third row. Lawyer Vance.
Is
my reading of Clause 14 correct? Lawyer Vance swallowed hard. He looked at Melanie, then at Eaves before slowly standing up. He adjusted his glasses, his voice trembling slightly. If the recheck proves bad faith scoring from the core family, Clause 14 is automatically activated. The Oliveira Group's 30% capital injection into the estate project must be returned within 48 hours, and the commercial rights to the South Bay development revert entirely to Miss Oliveira. A collective murmur erupted through the room. The South Bay development was the crown jewel of the Lawson family's entire portfolio for the next decade. Without the Oliveira family's land usage rights and initial liquidity, the project was nothing more than an expensive pit of unexcavated dirt and bank loans. In my previous life, I had endured the humiliation, swallowed my pride, and let them hold my capital for an entire year while they built their foundations on my money. Once the project was secured and profitable, Eaves had drafted a ruthless prenup that stripped me of every right, while Wendy slipped into the spot I had spent years building. Not this time. You can keep your three-generation family rules, Mrs. Lawson, I said, taking off my engagement ring. The heavy emerald caught the stage light as I flipped it through the air. It landed with a dull clink inside Melanie's teacup, splashing cold, tannin-stained liquid over the silver rim. And you can keep your candidate. I turned my head to look at Wendy, who was sitting frozen, clutching her fake tear-stained tissues. She's already wearing the dress, I said flatly. She might as well take the
debt too.
Without looking back, I stepped down from the stage. Mr. Zimmer packed his laptop into his leather case and followed half a step behind me, acting as an impromptu barrier against the stunned family members who tried to reach out. Amelia.
Wait.
Eaves shouted, shoving past a chair as he chased me down the central aisle. Amelia, let's talk about this. It was a mistake. My mother set up the scoring rules. I was just trying to follow protocol so the elders wouldn't complain about your family's background. I did it for us. I didn't slow my stride. As I pushed open the double oak doors of the Lawson main hall, the crisp, cold night air swept over my face. My private car was already waiting at the bottom of the stone steps, its engine idling silently. My secretary, Assistant Chun, opened the rear door the moment
He saw me.
Eaves grabbed the doorframe before I could slide inside. His hair was disheveled by the wind, his breathing ragged. Amelia, you can't pull the capital.
The
South Bay project will freeze. The banks will recall our short-term notes by Friday. I looked at him, taking in the panic in his eyes. It was the first time in 2 lives I had ever seen Eaves Lawson look genuinely afraid. Then you'd better start writing a new prenup for Wendy, Eaves, I said calmly. Maybe her family can lend you the $200 million. She doesn't have $200 million, Eaves bellowed, losing all his polished composure. She's a nobody. Her father runs a failing logistics firm that lives off her scraps. Behind him, standing near the top of the grand stairs, Wendy had just run out to follow him. His words carried cleanly through the night air, striking her like an invisible whip. She stopped dead in her tracks, her face turning ghastly pale. Under the porch lights, I smiled, pulled my door shut, and said to the driver, "Drive." The sedan glided smoothly away from the Lawson estate, leaving the towering, wrought iron gates behind. Inside the vehicle, the ambient lighting cast a soothing blue hue across the leather interior. I leaned my head back against the headrest and closed my eyes. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the confrontation slowly began to recede, leaving behind a profound, icy clarity. Assistant Chin turned from the front passenger seat, holding an iPad. "Miss Oliveira, the notice of contract termination and capital freeze has been electronically delivered to the Lawson Group's board of directors and their primary lending institution, First Commercial Bank." "Good," I said, opening my eyes. "What's the status of the South Bay construction permits?" "They were filed under your personal corporate entity, Oliveira Development," Chun replied briskly, "because the Lawson Group failed to finalize the marital trust by the agreed deadline of midnight tonight. The temporary authorization we granted them automatically expires as of 8 a.m. tomorrow. Any work on the South Bay site constitutes illegal encroachment. Call Construction Chief Miller," I ordered. "Have him move our security teams onto the site tonight. Lock the gates. Cut the power supply to the heavy machinery leased under our name." "Understood." Chun hesitated for a second before continuing. "Miss Oliveira, Mr. Lawson has tried calling your personal lines 7 times in the last 10 minutes. Miss Shaw has also sent 14 messages." "Block Eaves," I said coldly. "Leave Wendy unblocked, but set her chat to mute. I want to see how far a rat will run when the ship starts taking on water." 10 minutes later, my phone screen lit up. A notification from Wendy popped up. Silently, "Amelia, please don't do this. I know you're hurt, but I only scored you low because Eaves told me to. He said if your score was too high, your family would demand too much equity in the project. I was just trying to help him manage his family pressure. I never wanted to take your place." I stared at the message and let out a short, quiet laugh. In my previous life, Wendy had used this exact same rhetoric, playing the innocent mediator, pretending to balance the interests of both sides while secretly feeding Melanie every detail of my personal insecurities. She had convinced me that being humble and yielding would earn me the Lawson family's respect. And my reward for that yield had been a delayed wedding, a rewritten contract that stripped my family's asset protection, and a sudden, accidental car crash. On the eve of their new wedding date, after I discovered their hidden ledgers, I typed back a single sentence.
"Keep the gown, Wendy.
You'll need something nice to wear when the liquidators show up." I flipped the phone face down. By midnight, news of the Lawson-Oliveira rift had already begun to circulate through the upper crust of the city's business elite. It wasn't framed as a petty quarrel between lovers. The sudden withdrawal of a 200 million yuan capital line was a tectonic shift in the market. At 1:30 a.m., my father called. "Amelia." His deep, tired voice resonated through the speaker. "I just received a call from Melanie Lawson. She was crying on the phone saying you had a misunderstanding with Eaves and acted impulsively at the estate." "Did she tell you about the scoring system, Dad?" I asked quietly. "She mentioned something about an automated evaluation." My father said, his tone sharpening. "She claimed it was a traditional formality that you took too personally." "They gave me an 89, I said, keeping my tone steady. "Eaves gave me a 3. Wendy Shaw gave me a 1. They used a hidden risk control clause to trigger a mandatory 1-year delay so they could lock our capital in the South Bay project while keeping me out of the family trust." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The sound of heavy paper being shuffled echoed over the receiver. When my father spoke again, all the fatigue had vanished from his voice, replaced by the razor-sharp authority of a man who had built a corporate empire from scratch. "Assistant Vance," my father called out to his secretary in the room with him. "Cancel the morning meeting with the Lawson Group's finance director. Pull all secondary guarantees we placed for their short-term bonds." "Dad." "You are my only daughter, Amelia," my father said, his voice soft but unyielding. "If the Lawsons think they can treat an Oliveira like livestock to be evaluated and discounted, I will make sure they don't even have a barn left to stand in by next week. Come home. Let's have breakfast together tomorrow." "I'll be there, Dad," I said. As the car pulled into the driveway of my family's private estate, I looked out the window at the clear night sky. The trap had been sprung, but this was only the beginning. Reclaiming my life meant making sure the Lawsons and Wendy Shaw could never rise again. The next morning, the financial news was dominated by a single headline. Lawson Group shares plummet 14% at opening bell following South Bay project. Halt. Photos of the South Bay construction site, now locked with heavy steel chains and guarded by Oliveira security personnel, were spread across the front pages of every major business journal. I sat in the sunny dining room of the Oliveira estate, sipping fresh coffee, while reviewing the morning's intelligence reports with Assistant Chen. The Lawson Group's board of directors called an emergency meeting at 7 a.m. Chun reported, leaning over the table to point at a structural diagram. Melanie. Lawson attempted to calm the major shareholders by claiming the contract. Termination was a temporary negotiation tactic by our family. However, first, Commercial Bank has already sent an official inquiry demanding proof of liquidity for the 50 million yuan loan maturing this Friday. Where is Eaves? I asked, cutting a piece of poached egg. He was seen outside our building at 6 o'clock this morning, Chen said with a faint sneer. Security barred him from entering the lobby. He's currently sitting in his car in the underground parking lot, refusing to leave. Let him sit, I said coldly. How is Wendy handling things? Miss Shaw attempted to enter the Lawson corporate headquarters 2 hours ago, claiming she was the special assistant for the wedding liaison, Chen replied, pulling up a video clip on his phone. Melanie Lawson had her turned away at the front desk by security. From what our source inside the building says, Mrs. Lawson blamed Wendy entirely for the public recheck incident. I took a slow sip of coffee. Melanie was predictable. When things went well, she took the credit under the guise of family tradition. When things blew up, she needed a scapegoat. In my previous life, I had been her scapegoat. This time, Wendy was filling the role perfectly. Miss Oliveira, Chen added, his expression turning serious. There is one development. Eaves's uncle, Richard Lawson, has just returned from overseas. He holds 25% of the Lawson Group's voting shares and has long been at odds with Melanie's faction. I paused. Richard Lawson, the dark horse of the Lawson family. In my previous life, he had been ousted from the board 6 months after Eaves and Wendy got married, his shares bought out at a discount during the height of the South Bay project success. He was a shrewd, ruthless businessman who hated Melanie's traditional posturing. Reach out to Richard Lawson's assistant, I said, putting my coffee cup down. Tell him I'd like to invite him for afternoon tea at the Grand Hyatt. Understood. At 10 a.m., I finally decided to step out of the house. As my sleek black Rolls-Royce exited the residential gates, a disheveled figure bolted from a parked sedan on the side of the road, throwing himself directly toward the front bumper. The driver slammed on the brakes. The car stopped less than 2 feet from Eaves Lawson. Eaves didn't care about the close call. He rushed to the rear door, banging his palms against the tinted glass. Amelia, open the door. Please, just give me 5 minutes. He shouted, his voice hoarse and desperate. His expensive tailored suit was rumpled, his hair uncombed, and dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes. I rolled down the window just 2 inches. You have 1 minute, Eaves, I said, looking at him with detached indifference. Amelia, it was all a mistake. Eaves practically sobbed, gripping the top edge of the window glass. My mother set up the scoring system. She told me that if we gave you a perfect score, your father would demand controlling interest in the South Bay Holding Company. She forced me to score you low to protect our family's authority. And Wendy, I asked softly, did your mother force you to let Wendy wear my gown and pin my mother's brooch to her chest? Eaves's eyes flickered with guilt. Wendy meant nothing to me. She was just someone who listened when I was stressed. She manipulated me, Amelia. She was the one who suggested that a delayed wedding would give us time to reorganize the capital structure. It was her idea. How fast the rat bites its accomplice when the trap snapped shut. In my previous life, Eaves had sworn that his bond with Wendy was pure, born of deep understanding and shared intellect, while I was merely an overbearing heiress who bought my way into his life. Now, under the weight of financial ruin, Wendy was nothing more than a manipulative distraction. Eaves, I said, reaching into my bag and pulling out a small black USB drive. Do you know what's on this? He blinked, confused.
What?
It's the server logs from the Lawson venue yesterday, I said calmly.
It
doesn't just show your votes. It shows the private text exchanges between your tablet and Wendy's tablet during the appraisal event. You messaged her at 8:15 p.m. saying, score her a 1. Once the delay is locked, I'll transfer the 10% advisory fee to your father's account. Eaves gasped, his face turning ghostly white. He reached desperately through the narrow window gap to grab the drive. Where did you get that? I pulled the drive back, safe out of his reach. You thought Mr. Zimmer was just a third-party vendor you hired, I murmured. You forgot that his firm's parent company is a subsidiary of Oliveira Tech. I clicked the window control, rolling the heavy glass back up. Your minute is up, Eaves. Amelia. Amelia, please. He screamed, slamming his fists against the glass as the car accelerated away, leaving him tumbling onto the hot asphalt in the middle of the road. The private dining room on the top floor of the Grand Hyatt offered a panoramic view of the city's financial district. Across the linen-covered table sat Richard Lawson, a gray-haired man in his late 50s with sharp, hawkish eyes and a tailored charcoal gray suit. He cut his steak with precise, measured motions before looking up at me with an amused smile. You've caused quite a storm in less than 24 hours, Miss Oliveira, Richard said, his voice deep and resonant. Melanie is currently crying in the boardroom, accusing you of destroying 30 years of Lawson family reputation over a childish misunderstanding. A misunderstanding that cost her company $200 million in capital and 14% of its market cap in a single morning, I replied smoothly, taking a small sip of sparkling water. I call that an adjustment. Richard chuckled, setting his knife and fork down neatly. I never liked Melanie's ridiculous appraisal nonsense. She picked it up from some outdated, aristocratic manual 40 years ago and used it to suppress every woman who tried to enter the family. But Eaves was always her golden boy. Foolish, arrogant, easily led by the nose. Which is precisely why the Lawson Group is failing under their leadership, I said, leaning forward slightly. You hold 25% of the voting equity, Mr. Lawson. With the stock plunging, the institutional investors are terrified. If a motion to remove Melanie as chairwoman and strip Eaves of his executive director title is raised at tomorrow's emergency shareholder. Richard's eyes narrowed, a sharp glint of ambition flashing across his face.
I
would still need another 15% of the voting proxy to force the motion through. Melanie still controls 40%, and the float is scattered. I gestured to Assistant Chun, who immediately placed a bound legal folder on the table between us. This is an agreement for Oliveira Capital to acquire your 25% stake at 20% above current market value, I said. In exchange, you will use our backing to launch a hostile tender offer for the scattered floating shares tonight. By 9 a.m. tomorrow, you will hold 42%.
combine
That with our corporate leverage, and you take full control of the Lawson Group. Richard stared at the folder, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the tablecloth. And what do you get out of this, Miss Oliveira? You pull your money, kick my nephew out, and buy into a company currently bleeding cash? I don't want the Lawson Group, I said coldly. I want the South Bay project. You will execute a corporate restructuring that spins off the South Bay land usage rights to Oliveira Development for a nominal fee of 1 yuan to satisfy their outstanding debt default to us. After that, you keep the rest of the Lawson Group, cleaned of Melanie's influence and freed from Eaves's incompetence. Richard stared at me for a long, silent moment. Then a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. You are far more dangerous than your father ever was at your age, Amelia, he said, pulling an elegant silver fountain pen from his breast pocket. My nephew didn't just lose a bride. He handed an army to his worst enemy. He flipped open the folder and signed his name in smooth, decisive strokes. While Richard and I were finalizing the terms of the takeover, Wendy Shaw was experiencing her own private hell. Having been thrown out of the Lawson corporate building by security, she had retreated to her family's small logistics company office. But peace was nowhere to be found. At 3 p.m., 4 black sedans pulled up outside the Shaw Logistics headquarters. A group of auditors from the City Tax Bureau, accompanied by corporate investigators from the Oliveira Group, walked into her father's office with a formal audit warrant. Mr. Shaw, the lead auditor announced, placing a red-stamped document on the
desk.
We have received an official tip regarding unreported offshore transactions and fraudulent invoices totaling 12 million yuan over the past 3 years, specifically linked to kickback contracts provided by Eaves Lawson. Wendy, who had been sitting in the corner trying to reach Eaves on her phone, stood up in horror. What? That's impossible. Eaves promised those contracts were legal. Her father, an overweight man in his late 50s, turned deathly pale.
He
grabbed his heart, staggering backward against his desk. Wendy, what did you?
Do.
What did you have to do with Eaves Lawson's contracts?
I.
I just signed the transit forms he gave me. Wendy sobbed, her phone dropping to the floor. He said it was just a way to move project expenses without going through Amelia's corporate accountants. In her desperate attempt to secure a place in the Lawson family, Wendy had willingly served as Eaves's secret bagman, signing fraudulent logistics receipts in exchange for his promises of wealth and status. In my previous life, she had used those exact funds to buy her way into upper society circles while I was kept in the dark. Now, those very receipts were a paper trail leading straight to a prison sentence. The next morning at 9 a.m., the atmosphere inside the grand glass boardroom of the Lawson corporate tower was electric. Melanie Lawson sat at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing a dark navy suit and heavy makeup designed to hide the hollow dark circles around her eyes. Eaves sat to her right, his arms crossed, staring vacantly at the table's surface. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows. "Let us begin," Melanie announced, her voice ringing with forced confidence as she looked around the table at the gathered board members. "Regarding the recent market volatility, I assure the board that the Lawson family is in full control. The temporary delay with the Oliveira family is being resolved through private diplomatic channels."
Boom.
The heavy double doors of the boardroom were pushed open with tremendous force. Richard Lawson strode in, flanked by 3 senior corporate lawyers and Assistant Chun. Behind them, wearing an immaculate white sharp-tailored suit, walked me. The board members gasped. Several stood up instinctively. "Richard." Melanie's voice cracked slightly. "What is the meaning of this? This is a closed board meeting. Amelia Oliveira has no standing here." "She has every standing, sister-in-law," Richard said smoothly, walking down the side of the table and pulling out the leather executive chair directly opposite Melanie. He sat down and crossed his legs with total composure. "As of 8:30 this morning, Oliveira Capital and I jointly hold 46.5% of the voting shares of Lawson Enterprises." Melanie's face twisted in shock.
What?
"That's impossible. Where did you get the float?" "The retail investors were fleeing your sinking ship, Melanie," Richard replied coldly. "We simply bought the wreckage. And, as the majority voting bloc, we have called an immediate vote on Board Resolution 104. He gestured to his lawyer, who distributed thick white folders to every board member present. "Resolution 104, the lawyer declared in a clear, booming voice, calls for the immediate removal of Melanie Lawson from the position of board chair, the immediate termination of Eaves Lawson as executive director due to gross financial negligence and ongoing criminal tax investigations, and the appointment of Richard Lawson as interim chairman." "You can't do this," Eaves screamed, jumping up from his seat, his chair falling backward with a loud crash against the carpet. "This is our family company.
My
grandfather built this." "Your grandfather built a construction firm, Eaves," I said, stepping forward, until I stood at the edge of the table, looking down at him. "You turned it into a money-laundering vessel for your mistress's family." I tapped my fingers twice on the mahogany table. Assistant Chun turned on the central conference screen. Documents flashed across the display. Bank statements, forged shipping manifests, and encrypted messaging logs detailing the illicit transfers between Eaves Lawson and Shaw Logistics. These documents were handed over to the Commercial Crime Bureau 30 minutes ago, I said calmly, "including the transfer records where you promised Wendy Shaw a 10% cut of the South Bay asset value in exchange for manipulating the bride appraisal score to trigger the legal delay." The room erupted into chaos. Board members turned on Eaves, shouting over one another in anger. "You idiot," one elder board member roared, slamming his fist on the table. "You gambled the entire South Bay development for a side chick?" "Mother," Eaves panicked, reaching out to grab Melanie's arm. "Mother, do something. Tell them it isn't true." Melanie sat frozen. Her hands were shaking so violently that her gold pen fell from her fingers, rolling off the mahogany edge and dropping silently onto the thick carpet below. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of intense hatred and hollow realization. The 3-generation legacy she was so absurdly proud of, the strict hierarchy she had used to humiliate me, it had all crumbled in less than 48 hours. "Amelia?" Melanie whispered, her voice cracked and stripped of all its former regal authority. We were going to be family. How could you be so heartless?" "Family?" I echoed softly. I walked up to her chair, bending down slightly so that my voice was right next to her ear. In my previous life, Mrs. Lawson, I begged you for grace. I waited a year, suffered your verbal abuse, and watched you hand my life's work to another woman before discarding me like trash. Melanie blinked, confused by my words. What? What previous life? What are you talking about? It doesn't matter, I murmured, standing straight again.
What matters is that
The score is settled. Richard raised his hand, cutting through the noise in the room. All in favor of Resolution 104, raise your hands. One by one, the independent directors, terrified of being dragged down by Eaves's impending criminal investigation, raised their hands. Within 10 seconds, every hand in the room was up except for Melanie's. Motion passed. Richard declared crisp LY. Security, please escort the former chairwoman and the former executive director out of the building. 4 uniformed security officers stepped into the boardroom. Don't touch me. I am Melanie Lawson. I built this building. Melanie shrieked, as 2 officers firmly took her by the arms, lifting her from her chair. Her carefully styled hair fell completely out of its bun, hanging in messy strands around her pale, wrinkled face. Eaves didn't even have the energy to fight back. As the officers grabbed his shoulders, his knees gave out, and he was dragged across the carpet like a lifeless ragdoll, his polished designer shoes trailing uselessly behind him. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass window, watching through the reflection as the mother and son were unceremoniously removed from the corporate empire they had mismanaged. Outside the tower, a crowd of reporters and photographers had gathered, tipped off by the sudden collapse of Lawson stock. When the glass doors opened, security shoved Eaves and Melanie out onto the concrete plaza. Instantly, a wall of flashing camera bulbs lit up the morning.
Gray.
Mr. Lawson, is it true you are under investigation for corporate tax fraud? Mrs. Lawson, have you been officially removed from the board? Is the South Bay project bankrupt? Microphones were thrust ruthlessly into their faces. Melanie tried to cover her face with her designer handbag, but a reporter knocked it aside in the scramble. Eaves stumbled on the stairs, falling face first onto the stone pavement in front of dozens of rolling cameras. Sitting inside a silver sedan parked across the street, Wendy Shaw watched the nightmare unfold on the live news stream on her phone. She was sweating profusely, her phone buzzing incessantly with calls from her father's desperate lawyers and the tax bureau's enforcement officers. No, this can't be happening, Wendy muttered to herself, her fingernails digging into her palms. Eaves was supposed to protect me. He said the Lawsons were untouchable. Suddenly, her car door was pulled open from the outside. Wendy gasped, looking up. 2 uniformed police officers stood outside, accompanied by an investigator, holding an arrest warrant. Wendy Shaw, the investigator asked sternly. I didn't do anything, Wendy squeaked, shrinking back against the passenger seat. It was Eaves. He forced me. I was just his friend. You have the right to remain silent, the officer said, reaching in and pulling her out of the vehicle, slapping a pair of heavy, cold steel handcuffs over her wrists. You are under arrest for accessory to corporate fraud, tax evasion, and grand larceny. Amelia, Wendy screamed hysterically into the empty street as the handcuffs bit into her skin. Amelia, save me. We're best friends. Amelia, her screams were swallowed by the roar of passing traffic. 1 month later, the South Bay development site was no longer a silent pit of frozen machinery. The black iron gates bore a massive new sign gleaming under the bright afternoon sun. Oliveira South Bay Innovation Park. Heavy yellow cranes moved seamlessly against the blue skyline. Hundreds of workers in high-visibility vests moved with disciplined efficiency across the sprawling construction grounds. I stood on the observation deck of the temporary headquarters, wearing a white hard hat and a tailored navy trench coat. Assistant Chin stepped up behind me, holding a tablet and a stack of signing documents. Miss Oliveira, Chin reported, the groundbreaking ceremony for Phase 1 was a complete success. All 64 commercial units reserved for high-tech tenants were sold out within 20 minutes of the opening bell. What is the final valuation prediction for the holding company? I asked, looking out over the bay. The board estimates Oliveira Development's total market cap will surpass 3 billion yuan once Phase 2 completes next spring, Chin replied, a rare smile breaking across his usually stoic face. We have completely absorbed all prime assets formerly held by the Lawson Group. And the Lawsons? I asked, keeping my tone light. Chun flipped a page on his tablet. Richard Lawson successfully completed the corporate debt restructuring. He sold off the Lawson family's residential real estate to cover the short-term bank loans. The main estate, including the grand hall where the bride appraisal took place, was liquidated at auction 3 days ago. Who bought it? An anonymous buyer through our corporate subsidiary. Chun smiled slightly.
We
Are currently converting the main hall into a public community center for domestic violence advocacy and legal aid. I turned my head and gave Chun an approving nod. Poetic. And Eaves? Eaves Lawson was sentenced yesterday morning, Chun said, his voice turning
cold.
for his role in the tax fraud, supply chain kickbacks, and corporate asset stripping. He received 8 years in state prison. His application for bail was denied due to flight risk. And Wendy? 6 years, Chun answered. Her family's logistics company declared bankruptcy, and all their personal assets were seized to pay the restitution fines. Her father is currently living in a rented basement unit on the outskirts of the city. I turned back to look out over the glittering waters of the South Bay. In my previous life, this day had belonged to them. They had celebrated their grand wedding on a lakeside field built with my family's stolen wealth, while I lay forgotten in a hospital bed, my name ruined, my family broke. Now the sun was shining on my empire. My phone chimed in my pocket. It was a notice from the state prison system regarding a visitor request. Eaves Lawson had submitted 3 consecutive requests from his holding cell, begging for a 5-minute meeting before his transfer to the penitentiary. I looked at the notification for a second, then clicked decline all future requests. Some people don't deserve an explanation. They don't even deserve a final
Goodbye.
before the conversion of the former Lawson estate began, I decided to visit the property one last time. The autumn wind rustled the dead leaves across the grand stone driveway.
The
Tall iron gates, once open only to the city's top elite, hung slightly off their hinges, their gold leaf crests chipped and dull. I walked up the stone steps in my high heels, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty, cavernous entrance hall. The mahogany tables were gone. The crystal chandeliers were covered in protective plastic sheets. The stage where the bride appraisal screen had hung was now just a bare wooden platform covered in a fine layer of white dust. Sitting on the bottom step of the stage was an old woman wearing a faded, oversized gray wool coat. It was Melanie Lawson. She looked 20 years older. Her hair was completely gray, tied back in a messy bun with a rubber band. Her hands, once adorned with multi-carat diamonds and manicured to perfection, were raw, red, and covered in liver spots. She held a cold paper cup of water, staring blankly at the dusty floor. When she heard my heels clicking against the marble, she slowly raised her head. For a moment, her vacant eyes flickered with a flash of her old arrogance, but it died out instantly, replaced by a hollow, terrifying emptiness. "You came to gloat," Melanie rasped, her voice dry like scraping sandpaper. I stopped 10 feet away from her, standing straight, my arms folded inside the pockets of my coat. "I came to see the house before the demolition crew arrives tomorrow," I said. Quietly, Melanie let out a bitter, shivering laugh. "Demolition, you're tearing down a 3-generation heritage. A 3-generation house of cards built on arrogance, exploitation, and cheap tricks," I corrected her flatly. "You judged women on a scale of 1 to 100, Mrs. Lawson. You treated people like livestock to maintain the illusion of your own nobility. But when the wind blew, you didn't even have enough strength to stay standing." Melanie dropped her paper cup. The water spilled over her worn shoes, but she didn't even move her feet. Eaves was my only son," she sobbed, tears cutting dirty tracks through the dust on her hollow cheeks. "He's in prison, he's 30 years old. Amelia, his life is over. He put himself there," I said. "He chose to cheat, he chose to lie, and he chose to sabotage the woman who was willing to build a future with him. He scored me a 3, Mrs. Lawson. But on the scale of human decency, he was always a 0. I turned around and walked toward the grand double doors. "Amelia," Melanie called out desperately behind me, her voice echoing through the empty mansion. If you had just accepted the delay, if you had just waited the year like a good daughter-in-law, we would all be happy right now. Why couldn't you just submit?" I paused at the threshold, the bright autumn sunlight casting my long shadow across the dusty marble floor behind me. I looked back over my shoulder, my face cold and unyielding. "Because, Mrs. Lawson," I said softly, "rules are rules. And I don't play games designed by losers." Without looking back again, I stepped out into the sunlight. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind me, sealing the Lawson family legacy into the dust of history forever. 6 months later, the annual City Business Gala was held at the Grand Imperial Ballroom, the highest-tier social gathering of the year, reserved strictly for the top titans of industry, political figures, and international investors. The red carpet outside was lined with hundreds of reporters, security personnel, and luxury vehicles. A sleek black customized Maybach pulled up to the main entrance. The valet opened the door, and I stepped out onto the red carpet. I wore a floor-length emerald green silk gown, tailored with clean, modern lines that flowed effortlessly with every step. Around my neck hung my mother's restored diamond necklace, catching the blinding flash array of 100 camera
Bulbs.
Miss Oliveira. Over here. Amelia. Look to the left. Miss Oliveira. Congratulations on the South Bay Innovation Park's opening. I offered a graceful, composed smile to the press, stepping through the grand entrance into the warm, golden light of the ballroom. Inside, the room was filled with familiar faces, CEOs, venture capitalists, and high-ranking officials. The moment I entered, the atmosphere shifted. People turned, their eyes filled with respect, admiration, and a healthy dose of fear. They no longer saw me as the Oliveira heiress who was engaged to Eaves Lawson. They saw me as Amelia Oliveira, the woman who had single-handedly dismantled one of the city's oldest business dynasties in 48 hours and built a multi-billion-yuan tech hub in its place. Richard Lawson, now looking far more distinguished and relaxed in his role as chairman of the restructured Lawson Tech Group, walked over holding 2 glasses of champagne. He handed one to me with a respectful nod. To the real ruler of the South Bay, Miss Oliveira. To good business, Richard, I said, clinking my glass against his. I heard a rumor today, Richard said, taking a sip. Wendy Shaw tried to apply for a work release program from the Regional Detention Center last week. Her request was denied because she couldn't secure a single character reference from anyone in the city. Actions have consequences, I said indifferently. And Eaves? Richard asked tentatively. I don't keep track of prisoners, Mr. Lawson, I replied softly, my gaze looking out across the glittering ballroom. Right then, my father walked over, looking happier and healthier than he had in
Years.
He placed a warm, protective hand on my shoulder. Amelia, my father said, his eyes beaming with pride. The mayor would like to introduce you to the international trade delegation from Europe. They are looking for a primary partner for their Smart City initiative. Tell them I'll be right there, Dad. I smiled. My father nodded, heading back toward the VIP lounge. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling glass wall at the edge of the ballroom, looking out at the city skyline. Far across the bay, the bright LED lights of the South Bay Innovation Park glowed like a cluster of modern stars against the night sky. In my previous life, I had lived in the shadows of other people's expectations. I had let them grade me, judge me, delay me, and erase me. In this life, I rewrote the rules, reclaimed my power, and built an empire on my own terms. I took a slow, satisfying sip of champagne. The appraisal was over, and I had scored a perfect life.